Percy Shelley and John Keats. Neither lived to see their 30th birthday. Keats was born in London in 1795. In his youth, he studied medicine with an aim to becoming a druggist. In 1816, he qualified and a prosperous career beckoned, but by then his commitment to poetry had become established. Like Byron, he was passionate about the great ancient civilization of Greece, and in his first published volume of poetry, simply entitled Poems by John Keats, he describes the sensation he felt when he first encountered the works of Homer as translated by the Englishman George Chapman.
Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.
Keats' first collection of verse also revealed his passion for nature. Keats' genius was to take the most ordinary and everyday plants and animals and describe them with an easy delight. His choice of words to describe a humble pea plant are especially worthy of note.
Here are sweet peas on tiptoe for a flight, with wings of gentle flush or delicate white, and taper fingers catching at all things, to bind them all about with tiny rings.
Keats' concern with beauty was also expressed in his second published work, a collection inspired by the myth of the moon goddess, Endymion.
A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Therefore, on every morrow are we wreathing a flowery hand to bind us to the earth, spite of despondence, of the inhuman earth, of noble natures, of the gloomy days, of all the unhealthy and o'er-darkened ways made for our searching. Yes, in spite of all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits.
It was hardly surprising that Keats was aware of the darker aspects of life. Professionally, his work often attracted harsh criticism. This bad press contributed to his financial difficulties. In addition, his health was suspect. One of his brothers died of tuberculosis in 1818, and by 1820, John Keats had contracted the same cruel disease. His difficulties prevented him marrying the love of his life, a young woman named Fanny Brawne. But, like Coleridge before him, Keats responded to his troubled life by throwing himself into his work. In 1820, he published his third volume of poetry. It included 3 of the finest odes ever written: Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode on Melancholy. Given his circumstances, the concept of melancholy was entirely appropriate subject matter. In the final stanza of this timeless poem, he describes precisely where the state of melancholy is to be found.
She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips, aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung.
The notion of melancholy is important to the Romantics because it ties in with the great focus on introspection. If you think about it, introspection isn't really going to get very far if you're a happy person. There isn't going to be much to explore, much to say if you're just simply happy. Melancholy is a much more interesting mood if you want to explore the inner reaches of human psychology. This is something that, of course, wasn't discovered by the Romantics. Shakespeare knew it as well. And Hamlet, the great introspective melancholy hero, is very much the model of many romantic heroes. Melancholy was an appropriate romantic mood to fit in with the Gothic atmosphere of many romantic texts. Gloomy, dark, mysterious, not accessible to reason.
Like Byron, John Keats died at one of the great centres of ancient civilization. Late in 1820, he was sent to Rome by his doctor in the hope that the climate would ease his tuberculosis. It was a forlorn hope. On February the 23rd, 1821, at the age of just 25, he died in the Eternal City. There is no doubt that Keats himself suspected that his life would be short. One of his finest sonnets was concerned entirely with the thought of his own death. Published in 1818, it is a poem that provides a moving insight into the fears of a man whose short life produced some of the finest ever English verse.
When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold, like rich garners, the full ripened grain, when I behold, upon the night's starred face, huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink.
Keats's achievement was really to produce a poetry of unprecedented vividness of sensation. His poetry encapsulates what it is to be alive very, very intensely, and also, of course, what it is to feel that one hasn't got long to live. Keats, of course, was very interested in sensation. In his letters you can see he experimented with violent and intense sensations in order to discover what they were like so that he could write about them. For instance, putting pepper on his tongue and then taking cold claret just to feel the contrast in those intense sensations. Or he describes in one of his letters imagining what it would be like to be a billiard ball rolling around a table. So his great interest in just things comes out in his poetry, this wonderful concrete sense of the universe.
Looking back on the early 1820s, we can identify the end of the great age of English romantic poetry. Wordsworth and Coleridge were already past their peak. Keats died in 1821. Byron's death came 3 years later, and in the intervening time, the career of the final great English poet of his age was tragically cut short. His name was Percy Shelley.